I'm going to talk with you today about PediaTrac. It's as it says, it's a novel method to monitor and screen infant-toddler development and for longitudinal surveillance. And let's see. Oops. There are no disclosures. I need to report that this funding was for this project is through the National Institutes of Health, and to Dr. Seth Warshowski, one of my partners in crime on this project, through the Mildred E. Swanson Foundation. And okay, this is a little sensitive. What we're going to do today is I'm going to very quickly talk about some of the limitations of current infant-toddler developmental screening. I think most of us know what those are. We're going to talk about the potential value of parent-reported instruments and how, parents provide us with a completely different perspective on child development. And then we're going to talk about some of the differences that we're finding in term and preterm infants on motor, social, communication, and cognitive functioning using our new tool. I'm going to quickly go through this. So what we know about infant motor behavior is that it's sort of a window into neurodevelopment and the integrity of that system. And deviations in motor functioning obviously predict a really wide range of outcomes in language, cognitive functioning, academic achievement, adaptive functioning. And we really have very, very, very limited tools for tracking infant development. We also know that children are diagnosed with a host of neurodevelopmental difficulties, including CP at a much later time period. We sort of miss some of the critical periods for early intervention. ADHD is diagnosed at average age of 7, autism, some of the milder forms are diagnosed at an average age of 5, 5.5, developmental language disorders, 3 to 4 years of age. And then cerebral palsy, typically not until 4 to 5 for, again, milder forms. I throw this up here. I'm really an autism researcher, but you could take any neurodevelopmental concern or issue. The rates of, for example, ASD have been escalating for the past 2 decades, yet the median age of diagnostic assessment and intervention has remained the same. So the CDC and the American Academy of Pediatrics is attempting to address this issue by developing surveillance and screening methodology using milestone checklists. And I'm sure most pediatricians and physicians are familiar with these. And they just did an update that was published by Zubler in 2022 March. And what they're doing is they've modified the milestones and they're establishing a benchmark because we currently don't have sort of normative data to use to discern whether a child is not on track. And what happens is that pediatricians and physicians they have to sort of consolidate and synthesize really complex information about a host of behaviors and development without a really clear metric. And so the evidence-informed milestones that were currently set forth, they set a guideline of at least 75% of the children should achieve that particular skill or ability within a set time frame. But again, it's an absolute cutoff. And the problem is it doesn't provide us with any information about the sort of trajectories or what's the sort of change over time. It's cross-sectional data. There are early identification algorithms for CP risk. And again, each disorder has sort of its own algorithm that's being used and it's sort of an internal template for the physician or the clinician working with the individual. There are direct methods of assessment, and obviously people are familiar with the Bayley scales of infant development or the Mullen scales of early learning. And these are beautiful and wonderful, and they have great norms and continuous data, and we can understand a child's development when they're assessed cross-sectionally, but not, we can't examine sort of longitudinal change and the trajectories of change. And so one of the biggest problems with direct assessment is that we really have limited access to resources, personnel to do this. For example, this is data from the Department of Health and Human Services, the Health Resources and Services Administration, or HRSA. I think what's important to note here is what's on the bottom, that only 4,000 out of more than 100,000 US clinical psychologists and child and adolescent clinicians are sort of trained to do some of the most important assessments. And these are, assessments of early intervention. Now, we do have caregiver reported instruments used to assess early development. People are familiar with the ages and stages. It's the #1 tool used in epidemiological studies. The Denver developmental screening, very, it's a little bit antiquated at this point, but there are, domain specific measures for language or ASD risk, measures of adaptive behavior functioning, but really this is it. And none of these instruments allow us to examine trajectories of change in neurodevelopmental disorders. And when children, we have the ability to assess children cross-sectionally, but we can't look at change over time. And what we do know, I'm not going to read this, is that cross-sectional versus longitudinal changes are not the same in children. This is a recent study in 2022, and it demonstrated that, for example, children's structural brain development and its relationship to cognition cannot be inferred from cross-sectional age comparisons. And that's a really important take-home message. So we do assess developmental trajectories. The way that we do this is with some of the tools for assessing head circumference, weight, height, and that's it. We don't have other tools to do that. So the advantages of monitoring physical growth is that we can, sort of spot deviations as they occur. We can offer early intervention sooner, but we don't do this with other domains of development: motor, language, cognition, social functioning. And then the question is, what are the specific domains that we assess? And do we have, really robust methods for doing so? So there are some fairly recent measures of trajectories of development, primarily focused on motor development. The problem is that some of the data is inconsistent. When you look at sort of the predictors of outcome, and we're looking at things like, parent level of education, or their SES status. Sometimes we get biases in the data, and because caregivers, for various reasons, perceive their children differently, and we have to account for that variation in those outcomes. Sometimes, the children of more disadvantaged families are perceived as having higher language abilities or higher motor skills, and there has to be a way to account for that. What I can tell you is there's some very limited research on caregiver-reported trajectories using the Ages and Stages questionnaire. The problem is that the tool was developed in a way that doesn't allow for sort of an examination of continuous data. It establishes cut points, so they either meet sort of a risk category or they do not, and that does not allow you to examine growth over time or language development over time. And so the data is really complex and sort of ambiguous. So being a clinician, I've been frustrated by the fact that we don't have a tool, and I've been frustrated by the fact that I'm diagnosing children at 4, 5, 6 years of age when we should be really identifying risk in infancy, because we can. And we're really charged to do it better than we are currently doing it, so that we can offer early intervention within those first, 5 years of life. And so PediaTrac is a tool that I've been working on for about a decade. with first faculty from Eastern Michigan University, and most recently was within the past 5 to 6 years, the University of Michigan, Case Western Reserve University, Nationwide Children's, and now we're pulling UCLA in. And I'm really excited about the data. The data is really remarkable. And the goal is to have these sort of multi-dimensional trajectories or risk indicators. So to develop algorithms and to give you a hypothetical, it might be, this might be an algorithm that you see a child who has at 6 months of age, we start to see a decline in social communication and cognitive abilities. And that decline might occur concurrently, for example, with sensory motor functioning. And it might be a child who's at risk for ASD. And so if we can sort of establish these complex algorithmic phenotypes, we might be able to get kids into intervention sooner. So the aim of the study was to sort of refine this massive item bank that we developed with about 500 items. We're characterizing these unique developmental subgroups. Right now, we're primarily looking at term and preterm babies, and then to look at how well this PediaTrac method can predict developmental outcome. So as I said, we have a wonderful team, amazing. I couldn't do this work without Seth Warchowski and Dr. Alyssa Huth-Box. If you're interested in exploring the methodology, it's been published in BMJ. I can tell you right now, we have had such great luck because this is something that caregivers can do online on a smartphone. And so during COVID, we were able to recruit and enroll 571 caregivers, which is, I feel like, pretty amazing. It's a very, very diverse sample. We have, again, 58% of the population was term, 42 were preterm. Over 48% were identified as Black or African American or multiracial. Again, really diverse demographics with about a quarter of the population. The mom's maternal ed was some or completed high school. We have a huge part of the population that was at median level of income or below poverty. And what we did is we collected data across the time periods that correspond to the well-child visit, starting at the newborn period. And we collected data on these major domains, what we call early relational health. Some people are probably familiar with attachment. We have items on eating, feeding, and elimination, motor functioning. Right now, we call it social communication cognition, and we're allowing the data to help us sort of fractionate when those domains become more sort of individual. We have an experimental domain called social sensory information processing, and then sleep. So there's no tool that examines all of these domains across time and early development. So it's really pretty remarkable. And we are using established external criterion measures to validate. So we're looking at convergent and discriminant validity. I'm not going to go through this because I feel like right now I'm speaking like I'm almost hypomanic. So we're using a methodology called item response theory to really establish which items are going to provide us sort of with the most bang for our buck. Think about it this way. This particular framework allows us to examine children's abilities across the sort of ability level. So it's a latent trait methodology. So we can catch children who are really precocious, but also children who are very delayed. And then there's something, we get these item parameters that are help us predict outcome. And one of the important parameters is also how reliable is the metric and the tool and the domain that we're measuring. And reliability in item response theory is actually, it's sort of called precision. And so, or the statistical term is information. How much information does it provide us? And so I'm just going to whip right into the motor domain because it's the most interesting data ever. So these are some of the questions that are asked at the newborn period. What I can tell you, you're going to see in a minute, the reliability for caregiver report of these abilities at the newborn period, 0.94. I mean, that means parents are really reliable reporters about their children. And not only that, you're going to see that we can differentiate very, very early when their motor functioning is inconsistent between term and preterm. So one of the things that you'll see that's been a really interesting finding is that when we just look at motor, I'm going to be talking about 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, that preterm babies actually look better if we just look cross-sectionally at the newborn period. Part of this is because they've been out of the oven for a wee bit, right? Typically 8 weeks. And then they fail to maintain pace. And if we just look cross-sectionally, we get some statistical differences. They're pretty good, but wait until you see what happens when we look at trajectories. So when we look at trajectories, look at, this is sort of the difference at each time period over that first year in terms of our ability to detect term relative to preterm babies. This is really powerful. Are you guys still with me? Because I'm really talking fast. Okay, I just want to make sure that I get all of the information out. We're also looking at factor structure, and the factor structure is a little different from what our sort of typical, developmental literature tells us, because these are caregivers. These are caregivers reporting on their child's ability. We've done the same thing with social communication. We see differences at 9 months of age when we look at the data cross-sectionally. When we examine the data longitudinally, we see differences at 2, 4, 6, 9 months, and it's going to continue. And again, these are the sort of the factor structure. This is what parents observe in terms of their child's ability early on. And these are the reliability estimates across the time period. And if you can see, these reliability estimates are really unparalleled by any instrument or tool. They're marvelous. They're really actually too high. And part of that suggests that we have to, we're going to have to scale down. It means we have redundancy in our data and our item bank. And that's what we're in the midst of trying to do, is get funding so we can develop an adaptive version so that there may be 5 questions per domain. So that's it. How did I do? 10 minutes? If you have any questions, just ask me. The bottom line is we're moving toward developing an adaptive version of this. We want to have sort of clinical research applications for other childhood issues. We want to translate it to Spanish. We think it's really going to be powerful. So thank you. Appreciate your attentiveness.